Hello.
Hey.
Uh, Incredible book. It tells your childhood story. So let's start there. You were 5 years old. You were out playing. Suddenly there were rebel soldiers. What happened next?
I was playing that day. I had promised my dad that I'd be home before 6 p.m. At that time, the military leader had introduced a curfew for everybody to be home before 7 p.m. So I promised my dad that I'd be home before that time. I ended up playing soccer with my friends. Right in the middle, as I just scored a goal, running around screaming on top of my lungs with joy, I saw all these army trucks coming from the side. They came up, surrounded the soccer field. And at that time, I was so terrified, I didn't know what was happening, so I started to cry. And eventually, all these soldiers came behind us. They gathered us into a circle and started yelling at us and putting us into trucks and driving away.
At first you fought back, even though you were 5.
I did.
Yeah.
I did. As a child, I was a little bit of a troublemaker. When my parents told me to do one thing, I always did the opposite of what they told me. And so when these soldiers came up and they grabbed me, the first thing in my mind was I needed to call my dad and told them my dad would punish you if you don't take me back home. But they were laughing at me. And I think it was that sort of energy that I had that they really liked about me. And so as I kept fighting them back, they hit me with a gun. And I passed out. And the next thing that I remember is just being in the truck and literally on a bumpy road driving away.
Do you remember what you were feeling when you were in that truck?
Terrified.
Yeah.
Terrified, especially because in the truck I was by myself. My best friend Kevin, who eventually that I had been with since I was a kid, he was 12 years old. And the only reason why he was older than me is because as a child, I used to get in a lot of fights. And he was with kids that were bigger than me. And he was the one that always protected me. And so...
You're in the truck together.
I was in the truck by myself. He was in another truck.
Okay.
So all the younger kids like me were in one truck and all the other older kids were in another truck.
And what did they want from you?
No idea. They didn't tell us. But after we stopped driving, they told us to get out and they put us into lines. And that's when they told us that we were going to free our country from all the rebels that are there. They didn't tell us who they were or what rebels we were fighting, but they were telling us that we were going to free Congo.
Yeah. And at that point, you were initiated with something called Brown Brown. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, Brown Brown is a mixture of cocaine and gunpowder, and it's used for people who've seen the movie Blood Diamonds. It's explained in there as well, and so for me, I didn't know what this was, but when we stopped at this camp after driving, they told us to get out. They put us into lines, and then the rebel commander started walking through the lines, screaming on top of his lungs that they're going to initiate us into their army. And so they grabbed my left arm, and they grabbed a knife, and they slashed my wrist. And as I was bleeding, they took a substance that I said brown, and they rubbed it into there, put a bandage over it. And all I remember is just feeling this massive headache a few minutes later, and my head was pumping. I was sweating. I was crying. I couldn't remember anything.
5 years old.
5.
Yeah.
And that's the last thing I remember, and just being taken into this lineup where we're being lined up from age range. So from the 5-year-olds all the way to 12 were put in one line, and then 14 to 15-year-olds were put in another line.
And then something even worse happens. They blindfold you. They put a gun in your hands.
Yeah.
And what happened next?
Yeah, so put us into lines, and they started counting 1, 2. And so all the number 1s were put in one line, number 2s in another line. I was counted as number 1, and my best friend Kevin was in front of me as number 2. They grabbed the blindfold, and they blindfolded me. They dropped an AK-47 in my hand, and the rebel commander was yelling in my ears, and I could hear him loudly screaming, "Shoot!" And they kept yelling louder and louder to shoot, so I pulled the trigger. My hand, I really remember, is hearing a loud bang multiple times and my hand shaking, and I dropped the gun on the ground. And this is when the rebel soldier took off the blindfold. And I remember looking at my right hand at first, and there was blood coming from it. On my shirt, I was wearing a white Superman shirt. It was my favorite superhero. So that day I was wearing a white Superman shirt, and there's blood dripping from it too. And I looked a few feet in front of me, and my best friend Kevin was lying there in a pool of his own blood.
How hard is it for you to return there emotionally, to tell that story?
Difficult, constantly. It's something that I still struggle with to this day, nightmares every single day, the guilt of it. Although I've passed that guilt part before, but it's still a very difficult moment for me. But even when I go up and I speak on stage, there are moments where it's not as emotional, and then there are moments when it really hits me. For example, when I see somebody that kind of looks like my best friend or reminds me of Kevin, things like that always come back to me, and they make it a really difficult part for me.
Do you remember the first time you shared this story?
Yes, I do. The first time I shared the child soldier story was in a coffee shop in Toronto with a good friend of mine named Gary Norman. We were traveling to the United States on this program called O Ambassadors, which is a program that Oprah and the founder of Kids Can Free the Children, Craig Kilberg, had put together to go in inner city schools. And we're trying to find a speech, really. So we're writing a speech with Gary. And I told him that I had never told my child soldier story before, but I wanted to say it, because a lot of the kids that we were going to visit were kids who were in gangs, and they'd be able to relate in some way. So that was the very first time drinking coffee and having an omelet and crying in a coffee shop.
I want to go back to this story for a second when you're 5. So eventually you were able to escape.
Right.
How'd you do it?
It was difficult, but more than being afraid of these soldiers, I was afraid of my dad. My father was about 6 foot. He was about 6'8", 250 pounds. My father was a giant, and so when he said something, you had to agree with him. But again, being a troublemaker, I always defied him, and being the only boy. But so being in this rebel camp for 2 weeks, literally 2 weeks to put through training where they put someone in front of you and you're forced to kill them, and it was a brutal situation to be in. More than that fear was the fear of my dad. And so when we were told we're going over to a village to take over the village for food and medical supplies, I saw an opportunity to run. And they gave the signal for the kids to attack the village, and all the kids were running towards the village along with the adults. I laid in the grass and I waited, hoping that nobody would see me. And so 15 minutes later, I stood up, looked around me, and I saw a clearing of trees and ran towards that clearing as fast as I could, not looking back. And for 3 days and 3 nights, I ran through a jungle, literally escaping.
That courage you had since you were a little kid helped you out there. Michel, this is it's a great book. I loved reading it. It's sobering. It's challenging. What do you want young readers to take from this book?
I want young readers, one, to understand the context of the issue of child soldiers, but also the context to the continent of Africa. The reason why this is so important to me is because, one, when I see Africa talked about on the news, in media most of the time, especially here in North America and around the world, it's always presented in this very violent manner, as if somehow violence is just biologically entrenched to African people. And I really wanted the context to come through. So my story really is steeped into that context of why my story happened in the very first place. So one is to understand the context of the violence that was happening, so being educated about it. Two, having the courage to stand up for anything. Yeah. The fact that I was able to go through what I went through and have the courage to stand up and tell my story and be able to overcome all those challenges, then why can't you overcome what you're going through? All of us have that ability to overcome challenges.
So there's something universal there.
There is, yeah.
People can check out a really powerful excerpt, by the way, at cbc.ca/Q to see what you're talking about. You talked about that single narrative of Africa that's out there. Was that a worry for you that readers might take this story and just see one story about Africa, that this is a place where only bad things happen? Was that a worry for you?
At the beginning, it was a worry, but the great thing about working with Kids Can Press and Jessica Dee Humphreys, who's the co-author, along with Claudia Davila, who's the illustrator, one of my biggest points when we were talking constantly was really, again, talking about the context and steeping my story within that context. And we did an incredible job with the book of really making sure that comes through. So my story from the beginning all the way to the end there's an explanation of why this is happening, right? And although it's from a first-person narrative, there are moments within the book that was illustrated by Claudia that explains, for example, the history of the Congo and the dictator and why the politics was going on. Even
and
if
why
it's
people resort to child soldiers.
Exactly.
This book is aimed for kids 10 to 14. I know you went through this when you were 5. Right. But do you think this is a book kids can handle? Yeah,
I mean, the book, though, again, Claudia did an incredible job of really making sure that while the violence is there, it's not as graphic as, for example, and shocking for a lot of the audience. I wanted to make sure this book was accessible to that age range because I think there's such an important age group to understand what is happening in the world. If we want to understand what's happening on the continent of Africa and South America, then young people have to be given the information. And for me, this book was important to make it accessible to that age group. So I don't think it was going to be shocking in any way. It's going to be more accessible to them.
You wanted to make sure you're starting to teach that context younger.
Exactly.
Interesting. Yeah. I want to ask you about the activist message in this book. There's a like what you can do section. Yeah. Do you believe young readers, 10 to 14, can do something?
Oh, definitely. Having worked for Kids Can't Free the Children, for Free the Children, I've witnessed young people literally from a very young age doing fundraisers, really talking about issues that adults think somehow young people won't be able to understand. And I think that's part of our own ignorance as adults, leaving young people from the conversation of what's happening in the world. And I think if we're going to change the world in many different ways, and for me, that's through politics, because politics is power, then young people have to understand the complexities of what's happening in the world. We can't hide it from them, because whether we like it or not, it's happening to 5-year-olds in the Congo, in South America, in the Middle East, and there are gangs here as well. So violence is not just an African thing or developing part of the world thing, it's also here. And so young people have to understand that too.
And the world is interconnected, so sometimes we're complicit in this violence, and it is quite complicated. I also had a smile on my face towards the end because I was like, is Michel kind of slyly reaching parents too with this story? Is that a goal?
You know what? Yes, in the sense too. I'm really interested in the involvement of the whole family into this conversation, and that's why the educational part of the book, which is the second part of the book, really answers what you can do, or more questions and answers on the issues of child soldiers. We talk about Omar Khadr, which is a huge Canadian example, and I think something that people can relate to in the news. I really wanted parents to really open the book with their children on the coffee table in the morning or at night, and ask questions like, why is this happening? Why is this going on in the world? And so me, part of it, yes, is for the 10 to 14-year-olds, but as well for the parents too.
In this book, you go further than your escape. You tell the rest of your story. You talk about how you've moved on. Why is that important for you?
Again, part of it is trying to make sure that people understand that people who come to Canada who've gone through challenges, or either refugees or child soldiers or people who've gone through war, they don't stay within their violence. They don't stay within the violence. They can overcome it. They can move on and be better citizens if given the opportunity to. And I was very lucky that in my whole life I've been given that opportunity. And so part of it, yes, is to show that you can overcome violence. Secondly, to have courage. Again, that message of courage to overcome anything that you go through in every single day, in every part of your life.
And you quote what your father told you to that effect. If you ever think you're too small to make a difference, try sleeping in a room with a mosquito.
Yeah. I mean, my dad was, I think he had cheesy lines all the time. He was one of those guys that just had quotations for everything. But I think what I loved about him was that he was this incredibly tall, big man who was so humble and was so loving and courageous to stand up for everyone. And so for me, I wanted to make sure that his part of the lessons he taught me really came through. And part of those lessons is what he always encouraged me to always stand up for what's right, to always be knowledgeable, always pursuit of knowledge, and have purpose in your life. And so for me, that was a part of it.
And you're continuing his legacy. Can you talk about what happened to your father?
My father was a human rights activist in the Congo, and in the 1998 war, when Mobutu, who was the dictator who was in power for 60 years, along with other rebel soldiers from the east were fighting, my father was trying to tell the world what was happening in the Congo, that the war in Congo wasn't just, again, another African war, another example of African people being violent, that it was a war that had to do with minerals, and the United Nations was sanctioning countries to get into the Congo, but people didn't know any of this information. So along with doing that, he got a lot of people angry, especially the rebel soldiers who were profiting off of this war. And so my father was exiled in December 1998 and eventually was assassinated in 2001 for speaking the truth, for trying to teach the world the context to the war in the Congo.
And you feel like you're continuing his good work of standing up.
Yeah.
Finally, Michel, I want to ask you about something that's top of mind right now, the plight of refugees. You lived in a refugee camp. You lost family on your journey to Canada. What's important for North Americans to keep in mind as we read about people in situations that might seem very distant?
Yeah. Well, you know what? I'm very interested in politics constantly. And for me, the issue of refugee, especially here in Canada, is something that's so important to me. For example, our conservative government cut $53 million from the refugee assistance program when people come here. So that means language programs, healthcare programs, and things like that. $53 million, and they put $1.9 billion in deporting people. And yet we say we're fiscally conservative. And so for me, where is our interest, right? And so if we give programs to refugees to move here and give them opportunities to learn the language, to teach them about the laws, to integrate into the Canadian society, then of course they're going to be great citizens. I was given that opportunity, and look at where I am. I'm a great example of that, of being given an opportunity to strive for something better. And I think as Canadians and as citizens of the world in general, we have to embrace people, refugees, because one, Canada is a land of immigrants, was created by immigrants, and all of them face challenges moving here, and we also have to keep that in mind. And for me, it's understanding your own history is so important, and I think for so many Canadians, we believe that somehow because we're born here, this is our land, but this is not our land. All of us moved here from somewhere, and we have to understand our history and how challenging that was so that we better embrace people who are coming here as well, to give part to Canada as well.
Thanks so much for your words and for your book. It was great to have you here, Michel.
Thank you for having me.